Space, the final frontier. Oh, sorry, wrong show. This is Canadian Justice, and I'm Christine Van Gyn. And today we're discussing, you guessed it, the law of space. The term space law is used to describe the rules, principles, and standards of international law in a variety of treaties and principles developed by the United Nations. In addition to these international treaties, many nations have their own domestic legislation governing space. The Canadian Space Agency has been working on an update to their space policy framework. Canada has long been a leading presence in space exploration, perhaps most famously for inventing the Canadarm, a robotic arm used to fix things on the International Space Station, and for being home to some famous astronauts like Roberta Bondar and Chris Hadfield. What do we need to know about the laws of space, and how might these laws develop in the future? Here today to discuss this fascinating topic are two experts, Dr. Jakhu and Kuan-Wei Chen. Thank you both so much for joining me today. I guess let's start on Earth and work our way up. Dr. Jakhu, I'm interested in the laws around space rocket launches and development, including private development like we're seeing from Elon Musk's company SpaceX. Mr. Musk has sort of famously touted Texas as a jurisdiction where he can blow up rockets, which I guess seems surprising since you would think rockets are subject to federal regulation. What can you tell us about local, national, and international laws governing rocket testing and launching?
Wow, that's a big question. First thing is what I always say is there is no place where you see the potatoes and laws are everywhere. So naturally, space activities are governed by laws. And you said correctly, international, national, local laws all over. So let's just start with the international. First, the international law has been developed since, I would say, 1967, if not a little earlier, which governs all kinds of space activities in space, and including launch services. Launch services, as you know, they are the rockets which were manufactured or designed or built as missiles. So they are heavily regulated internationally and more at national level. So if you want to launch a satellite, and then that the two things are very important. First thing is who should be allowed to launch. So that means you need a license. At that license requirement is, of course, mandated at international level, but it is implemented through national legislations. So in somebody in the United States want to go, again, you said Elon Musk wants to launch a satellite, he or his company needs a license from the US government. So that is very important. The related to that is in case this launcher or rocket causes damage, and then the question of liability. So here is a little different from the terrestrial laws. So at international level, it's the responsibility and liability of the government of United States in this case, rather than Elon Musk. Of course, when the license is issued by US government requires SpaceX to procure insurance to cover the license in case US government is required to pay compensation for any damage caused by a satellite launch by Elon Musk. So this is essentially a combination of international law and national law. But in the US, I'm not an expert in the US law, but I am quite aware of that there are laws at state level. States have their own laws and they regulate quite a few things. For example, spaceports and then zoning, labor, environmental issues. So in the US, space law is very complex field of law.
Mr. Kuan-Wei, I'm sorry. We've only got about 40 seconds, but we're going to go into the next segment. But I want to, in the next segment, talk about the laws governing the satellites once they are in space. So, for example, can you just leave a broken satellite orbiting the Earth? What happens if two satellites in orbit crash into each other? What if one's a government satellite and one's private? Or what if a satellite left in orbit or a piece of space junk orbiting the Earth causes damage to something on its way up, or falls from orbit, damaging something on Earth or someone's property on Earth. We've got to go to break. I don't want to leave you to answer all of that with this short amount of time, but we will talk about it when we come back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the law of space. Kuan-Wei, I want to ask you about what happens once things are in space. For example, a rocket or a satellite in orbit around the Earth. Let's start with the notion of space junk, things that are left and abandoned orbiting the Earth. Is there any restriction on just leaving something orbiting the Earth?
Yeah, so as Professor Jakhu said, once an orbit is in space, again, there's a mixture of national and international laws that apply, and it all depends on what kind of activities you're engaged in. So Canada, for example, has a specific remote sensing Space Systems Act, which regulates everything from the collection of data through remote sensing to the storage and processing of such data, right? Unfortunately, in terms of space junk, again, there is at the international level no agreed law on what to do with such objects, right? There are, however, there's fortunately awareness by governments, we cannot continue to leave our objects up there because that may have catastrophic consequences when, space objects collide with each other. So, for example, the United States has very recently said, for space objects that were launched after, I believe, 2002, there is an obligation to remove them to what they call a graveyard orbit, right? So move them away from orbits that are very useful and that are quite populated.
Just to interrupt, I'm sorry, but how would you move an object that's in orbit?
Yeah, so a lot of space missions do have planned into them. They do. Some space objects carry extra fuel, right? So they can estimate, for example, this satellite the mission may be, let's say, 5 years, and they can plan into it that, after or just before the 5 years, there's some fuel that you can kind of move the object, let's say, further up into the so-called graveyard orbit, or bring that object down and allow the Earth's gravity to kind of pull it down and allow it to, kind of slowly disintegrate as it comes down into the Earth's atmosphere. Right? So
okay.
that is.
So it's more moving it up and down, not sort of horizontally around orbit, I guess.
Horizontally, because a lot of orbits are quite populated and quite crowded, especially if you're talking about low Earth orbit or the geostationary orbit, which is very useful for a lot of telecommunication and navigation purposes. It'd be quite dangerous to move it, in the same orbit because there might be other objects in place that belong to other countries.
Dr. Jakhu, what about objects that might fall out of orbit? If a piece of, abandoned space junk falls out of orbit and falls back onto Earth and damages property or a person, or if it collides to something else in orbit, what is the recourse? I mean, I guess there's two very different ideas. One is two things colliding in orbit, and one is if it falls to the ground. But is there any law that governs that?
Yes, there are laws. First thing is the colliding in space. It depends upon whose fault was that when the collision take place. And sometimes it's easy to find out because these satellites or the pieces are monitored regularly, particularly with the US government facilities. So, but at the same time, there are a number of countries which do not have the facility to find fault. I said the liability is based on fault. Whose fault was that? Right? And that means the person or the entity or the government which suffered the damage can make a claim, right? But in case it falls back to Earth and causes damage to on Earth, and then the victim has the recourse. There are two possibilities. One is, which is quite obvious, which is regulated internationally, is the state of the victim will make a claim against the state whose satellite caused the damage or has fallen back.
And where would that claim be made, though? Would it be made in the jurisdiction where it the object landed or in the foreign jurisdiction, or is there an international body that governs this?
Well, internationally, in case the satellite which caused the damage and the nationality of the victims are different, then is a matter essentially discussed through the governments. So there is no quotient jurisdiction here and there. For example, we have seen in 1978, the Russian satellite crashed in Canada, Cosmos 954. And so that means the government of Canada made a claim against Soviet Union at that time. So that claim was, of course, settled through negotiations. Right. So that is what, in case the satellite belongs to the same state.
Dr. Jakhu, we've got to go to break, but we'll finish this when we're back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the law of space. Now, Dr. Jakhu, in the last segment, we were talking about what happens if an object falls out of orbit and it was launched by one country but lands in another. You gave the example of an object that fell from Earth that had been launched by the Soviet Union. What recourse is there, though, if the two countries are not in good diplomatic relationships? I mean, you gave the example of the Soviet Union and Canada. Now that country would be Russia, and we don't really have great diplomatic relationships with that country. If we were to approach the Russian government about an object that they had launched that fell from space and injured a Canadian, I mean, what actual possibility is there of any compensation coming from the Russian government?
Well, first thing is they can choose a third country which is kind of friendly to both. In case we sort of. But again, there are opportunities for bringing the case to international court, for example. But that will require if both countries are party to the statutes of International Court of Justice. And there are other things. There are other ways of doing it. But there's also a possibility of bringing a case in the court of Russia, for example. Things move on. It may depend on the time. So those things, there is always a possibility of making claim.
Let's talk about moon landings. Kuan-Wei, are there any international agreements that govern who can land on the moon? And I think moving into that, there's a whole discussion of mineral rights on the moon and setting up permanent bases. Let's first talk about landing itself. Are there any agreements that govern who and when they can land on the moon?
Sure, yeah. So outer space, as mentioned before, is regulated by international law. And international law says that there is a freedom of use and exploration of outer space, which includes celestial bodies such as the moon and other planets, right? So literally anyone, any country can land on the moon. And we may be very excited to learn that the next person to land on the moon may very well be a female astronaut, which is very historic, right? So in terms of, mining rights, and I think you mentioned also bases, setting up bases specifically on the moon, it's prohibited to establish military bases, military installations, and fortifications. Otherwise, any form of base, let's say a base for scientific research or for mining, would be permitted.
Dr. Jakhu, what about the mineral rights on the moon? If you set up a mining operation on the moon, and there's a lot of mining happening now on ocean floors, which is also governed by international law. So who and how do you claim the rights to those minerals if there's to be mining in that area on the moon, or alternatively on I guess asteroids?
But that's a very controversial issue currently. They are internationally, and personally, in my view, ownership in large scale is prohibited. But I must admit, I may be in a minority. There are people, scholars, and the governments believe that whosoever goes and mine, and these companies or governments can own the minerals they extract. So that is it. The U.S. Passed a law which allows American companies go and extract resources on the moon and other celestial bodies and own that. Luxembourg has created similar law. So that is those laws not tested in any court. These laws have been put it, and there is some kind of issues which are percolating. Some governments do not believe that is allowed. The others say it's allowed.
What about, Kuan-Wei, what about if a crime is committed while in outer space? Sort of famously, there was an alleged crime committed by a NASA astronaut, I think about a year ago. What laws govern? I think that the claim was dismissed. The charges were not laid against that astronaut. But what laws would apply if there's a crime committed in space?
Yeah, so indeed, the claims were dismissed, and actually the same astronaut that was accused of that crime may be that female astronaut to be landing on the moon very soon, right? So in that particular case, because it happened on board the International Space Station, and particularly on board the U.S. module of the International Space Station, and it involved U.S. government property, it was very simply U.S. law that applied, right? But if let's say they were an astronaut who is a different nationality, who's a victim of the crime, well, the International Space Station has a specific agreement that deals with such issues such as, liability in case of injury, death, or damage, and also the persecution of crimes on board.
We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we are discussing the law of space. Dr. Jakhu, there is a Russian astronaut who is going to, I think, to the International Space Station, who's currently pregnant. So this raises a lot of really interesting issues. What would the nationality be of the baby if it's born in space? I don't think there's any plan for the baby to be born in space. I believe she's returning. But if for some reason the baby is born there, what would their nationality be? Would it be a Russian baby? Or what if it's born in a different part of the space station, subject to, it's the American part of the space station? Would the baby be able to claim American citizenship?
Well, first thing is we should understand that invariably laws of all countries determine nationality. So international law has relatively little to say about it. So the question is, if the mother of the baby is say Russian in this case, obviously it be the nationality of the child will be Russian. So that is again is a straightforward answer. There may be some minor issues here and there, but that is what it is. But it will be all determined by the Russian applicable law. Now, if the child is born on the American module, and then think in space, that may be a little bit different. I said I'm not expert in American law, but suppose if American law allows children to be born on American territory, and then, in my view, that child will get also American citizenship. So the question is that is a bit is complicated.
Really interesting. Okay, so this question is a little bit more out there, Kuan-Wei, but a lot of people have asked me to ask this. Are there any international treaties that govern first contact with alien life? What exists? Is there any agreement?
No, unfortunately there isn't. And perhaps this is an area that needs further research, right? So to elaborate, space law and international law generally has traditionally been very state-centric. So the laws and principles are centered around the idea of sovereignty and regulating the relations between states. So unfortunately, we haven't thought about potential encounters with alien life and how we would interact with them. But there are certain provisions on the possible contamination of other celestial bodies. Let's say we're landing a rover on Mars. There are some regulations in regard to it has to be a very clean rover, and there are also regulations about the possible contamination that may result from the return of samples from other asteroids, for example. Right? So that's the extent of our interaction, so to speak, with extraterrestrial life.
One of the other things I want to ask, we've got about a minute and a half left, is we've talked about mineral rights for the moon. What about things like small meteors? If they land on Earth, if they land on private property, like in your backyard, Dr. Jakhu, do you just own a meteor now if it lands in your garden? Or is there some government regulation that says you need to submit it to the space agency?
To the best of my knowledge, there is no law which prohibits the ownership of these natural meteorites falling on the backyard. If they fall, you can keep it. But that it depends. I have not really heard any national law even sort of governing. The government of the government, concerned government, may have some laws trying to look at those meteorites they want for research purposes, things like that. But I think my personal view is that the person who finds it owns that piece of space.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add, Kuan-Wei?
Yeah. So there is actually, so in Canada, there's a very old case law that and it was mentioned in passing that a meteorite falling on land would be part of that land, and therefore the owner of the land would claim ownership. But there are some countries that have adopted legislation which says meteorites, because of their unique scientific or cultural value, must be delivered to a state museum. Denmark is an example of that, and I believe Switzerland has also that.
That is all the time that we have today. This was a fascinating topic. Thank you both so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having us.
We've heard today about the fascinating legal questions that arise as we begin to explore outer space. Of course, there's so much unknown about space that we can't begin to predict some of the legal questions. But I hope today's episode has been a start. What do you think? What will human exploration of space lead to? You be the judge. I'm Christine, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.